They say something ancient lives beneath the surface of Lake Champlain. Something long. Something massive. Something fast enough to leave no trace and quiet enough to spark doubt. Eyewitnesses describe a dark, powerful body moving through the water like a serpent, with humps that rise in a steady line behind it and a long neck that breaks the surface only for a moment. A breath, a glance, then gone again. Some call it champ. Others insist it's imagination, distortion, distance. But for more than a century the descriptions have sounded the same. Even from people who had never met, never compared notes, never tried to build a legend together. It simply built itself. Because every year, sometimes in fog, sometimes at sunrise, sometimes under open skies, the neck, the humps, the shape, returns. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. Want more world-famous legends like this? Subscribe now, because the next sighting is always closer than the next explanation. The question was never whether the lake could keep a secret. The question is this: what really moves in the depths of the lake that locals still call, without irony or doubt, the most persistent mystery on the continent? The legend of Champ is one of those stories that feels familiar before you've even heard the details. A creature, described for generations, living in a lake people believed they already understood. Until enough witnesses made them question the assumption itself. The first layer of the legend comes from the Abenaki people, the indigenous tribe whose territory includes the lake and the surrounding forests. Their story spoke of a massive water serpent with horns or ridges near its head. They did not tell the story like a puzzle or a metaphor. They spoke of it the same way hunters spoke of moose, storms spoke of lightning, and rivers spoke of currents. As part of their world. Enormous, rare, and real enough to warn each other about without needing excitement to carry the moment. They called it Gitaskog or Tatoskok, both meanings referring to a giant lake serpent. Their elders spoke of seeing long dark shapes move in the lake during certain seasons. They described sudden breaches of the surface, the body often unseen below, sometimes showing ridges or protrusions on its head, and movement that was fast, deliberate, and brief. Their storytellers passed this creature into the minds of children, not as a symbol, but as a living unexplained animal. Part of the territory, though belonging to no human owner or explanation. What makes these stories important is that at the time they were independent of global influence. There was no worldwide lake monster narrative to mimic. No shared European dragon popular enough to confuse geographic folklore variation. It was a local story, rooted in environment, recognition, and recurrence. When Samuel de Champlain arrived on the lake in 1609, he unknowingly became the first outsider to write down what locals had already been speaking for centuries. Champlain was scouting the region for France. He was focused on lakes as landscape, waterways as routes, and fish as resource. What changed the future of this story was not a grand moment of shock, but the way he documented difference without theatricality. He wrote that he saw a long, thick-bodied serpent-like creature breach the surface briefly near the boat. He could not confirm exact features beyond that brief moment. He gave an estimated length of around 20 feet or 6 meters. His writing remained measured in tone, but not confident in classification. His men did not fall into panic, nor did they laugh at an exaggeration they knew wasn't true. They simply watched the lake close over it again. In his notes, Champlain used the term sea serpent, not because he thought it was a marine fantasy, but because he had no better word yet for something moving that way in a lake that size. Champlain had recorded it reluctantly, plainly, and without motive to entertain. By the 1800s, colonies had expanded. Towns now hugged the lake's edges. Ferries traveled daily. Commercial fishing increased. People saw more of the lake, which meant they saw more of what didn't match the expected world of biology. This era matters because this is where the name, Champ, first began appearing socially, not mythically. A shared nickname used informally by the people living and working beside the water. The term carried through taverns, docks, and local newsrooms. Not screamed, not flourished, just spoken as a common reference point for a recurring lake creature. That made it safe enough to repeat and dangerous enough to stay curious. In 1819, Captain Crum, sailing the lake, saw something enormous rolling the surface. A dark shape moving parallel to his boat. He could see several humps break the surface as it moved, and a long neck or head-like protrusion rise briefly before retreating under again. Newspapers loved the measurement, 187 feet or 57 meters estimated length. What made that moment explode into national attention was not the size he estimated, but that his description was internally aligned with all future tellings. Long-bodied, dark-humped, long-neck breech, directional movement. From that point, Champ was no longer an indigenous oral legend alone. Champ was a written, spoken, debated, unresolved animal story. The legend grew not by one man, but by dozens of everyday people, quietly adding their own encounters over decades. All sounding recognizable when spoken later, despite originating unconnected to each other. Then in 1883, Sheriff Nathan H. Mooney, standing at the shoreline with binoculars, reported seeing a large dark, serpentine creature move through the lake and surface briefly. He hesitated only when pressed for details, because the moment didn't last long enough to describe more than the structural resemblance to earlier accounts. But Mooney, a man associated with normal society, law, routine, validated none of these fragments deliberately. He simply confirmed the presence of something recurring in the lake that could not be defined by existing freshwater registries. He estimated the size at 30 to 50 feet, or 9 to 15 meters. Which matters for the story, because it neither inflated the legend nor solved it. It sat uncomfortably plausible in length, but implausible in coordinated humpline and long neck breech, to be sturgeon or driftwood. Through the 1900s, the lake kept producing witnesses. The story of Champ traveled mostly by word of mouth, told in short exchanges on docks. Repeated because the descriptions kept sounding alike when compared later, not because anyone planned them to be. In 1920, a group of men working near the shoreline saw something break the water at a distance. One described a long, dark shape that curved once above the surface. Another swore he saw rounded humps following behind it before it moved out of view. Their accounts were not dramatic, not embellished. They sounded like men trying to describe something unfamiliar, then realizing mid-conversation that they were describing the same thing. Decades later, similar sightings appeared in local Vermont and New York papers. None of them started a global hunt. They only documented that the lake kept producing moments people couldn't fully categorize. Fishermen spoke of seeing long shapes moving parallel to the shore. Some had seen a neck lift briefly above the water. Most saw nothing but humps, and only for a few seconds. The details were always partial, The resemblance, however, was consistent. By then, Loch Ness had already made the long-necked, hump-breaking lake creature a familiar global image. So when Canadian and American journalists heard the Champlain and Crum accounts placed beside newer sightings, the comparison to Nessie happened automatically. The long neck, the humps, the brief breech. The creature fit a known pattern of description, even though its own story belonged firmly to Lake Champlain. Then, in 1977, while vacationing with her family at St. Albans Bay in Vermont, Sandra Mansi captured the photograph that would change the scale of the debate. The image was showing a creature with a long, dark neck and several rounded shapes trailing behind it. Mansi was a tourist, not a cryptid investigator. Her unplanned photo immediately drew attention. Experts examined the original film negatives and found no compelling evidence of manipulation or composite editing. The image was treated as a legitimate, unexplained sighting rather than dismissed as deliberate fakery. What mattered most was not that the photo existed, but that it matched the descriptions people had been giving for decades. The year 1977 became part of the legend's timeline for a simple reason. It was the first time a steady, clear image aligned so closely with the spoken descriptions the region had already been repeating. The photograph sparked international interest, which meant research naturally followed. By the 1980s and 1990s, the legend of Champ had gained enough weight that serious investigation started. Universities and local researchers used sonar sweeps and underwater cameras to scan the deeper zones of the lake. The results were always the same, clear enough to justify looking again, but never clear enough to identify anything conclusively. Giant sturgeon were documented during this period, often proposed as an explanation, yet no sturgeon matched the most consistent part of the eyewitness descriptions. The long, dark neck, lifting from the surface, and the steady row of humps trailing behind it before submerging again. But the search didn't stop in the 1990s. It still continues today, driven by new witnesses who come forward with the same kind of reports. Sightings that are too similar to ignore, even when the evidence remains incomplete. And those eyewitness reports are very much alive. In 2025, locals again described seeing long dark shapes and surface breaches. The most recent, widely shared eyewitness footage came on July 14, 2025, when a woman walking the shoreline near Port Henry, New York, saw several dark humps rise briefly, followed by a long form slipping back beneath the water before her camera could capture more than seconds of conviction. Investigations today are quieter than the global hunts in Scotland, but no less persistent. Small boats with sonar still scan the deepest parts of the lake when new sightings point researchers back to the same stretch of water. Underwater cameras are still deployed into sections where light does not penetrate far enough for easy conclusions. Champ has not been solved. It has simply been seen again. And so they still say something ancient lives beneath the surface of Lake Champlain. Not because the world agreed on what it is, but because the witnesses agreed on what they saw. No proof was ever needed for the questions to grow. Only one breach of the surface, one shared description, one unforgettable encounter. Repeated again and again, across decades. And that's why the legend still travels today. Not because the creature fully reveals itself, but because the mystery never collapsed under its own weight. Thanks for watching. If you want more world-famous legends like Champ, please subscribe and join us at Myths After Midnight.